there are towns that fade quietly, and there are towns that are erased while people are still living inside them. Picher, Oklahoma does not look abandoned at first glance. The roads still trace a grid. The ground still rises and falls like any Midwestern town, but beneath the surface the town is hollow, excavated, flooded, and unstable. An entire community built on space that no longer exists. For decades, Picher helped arm a nation. The metal beneath this land became bullets, wires, infrastructure, the invisible backbone of modern America. And while the country moved forward, this place absorbed the cost, slowly and without ceremony. What does it mean when a town's greatest strength becomes its undoing? At what point does prosperity turn into something irreversible? And who decides when a place is no longer safe to exist? As you watch this, ask yourself, how many places like this do we pass without knowing what's underneath them? If this story makes you pause, if it raises questions you don't hear asked often, share your thoughts in the comments. And if you value serious, grounded documentaries that let the evidence speak, consider subscribing. Some stories disappear quietly, unless someone chooses to stay with them. Silence did not arrive suddenly here. It accumulated. Long before there was a town, before streets or schools or churches, there was a thickness in the ground. Beneath northeastern Oklahoma, inside the Boone Formation, sat a dense band of ore, lead and zinc compressed into a layer, barely wider than a city block is tall. 50 to 150 feet of material that would decide everything that came after, not scattered. Not rare, concentrated, accessible, profitable. This was the Tri-State Mining District, where Oklahoma, Kansas, and Missouri quietly overlapped underground. To the surface, it looked ordinary farmland. Below, it was one of the richest mineral zones ever found in North America. Railroads made it reachable. Early 20th century demand made it urgent. And the land itself made it easy. Mining here did not require deep vertical shafts or exotic engineering. The ore lay close enough to reach, thick enough to justify scale. Once the first drills went in, the logic became self-reinforcing. More tunnels meant more access. More access meant more investment. More investment meant permanence, or at least the illusion of it. This land belonged to the Quapaw tribe. The ground was leased. The minerals were extracted. The consequences would remain long after the contracts expired. When people later asked how Picher grew so fast, the answer wasn't ambition or vision. It was geometry. The shape of the earth made the decision before anyone else did. Rooms were carved underground like vast chambers. Pillars were left behind to hold the ceiling up. It looked stable. It felt engineered. It gave the impression that this could go on forever. But nothing above ground was designed with the underground in mind. Pause here for a moment. When a town is built on borrowed land and hollowed ground, who is responsible for what comes later? The miners? The companies? The systems that rewarded extraction and ignored aftermath? Write your answer in the comments. Not slogans, real thoughts. Picher did not grow. It assembled. After the discovery on Harry Crawfish's claim in 1913, the land didn't ease into settlement, it was occupied. Structures appeared as responses to shifts and wages. Streets followed the mines, not the other way around. This was a town calibrated to output. By 1918, it was incorporated. By the early 1920s, it was crowded. By 1926, more than 14,000 people lived here, drawn not by permanence, but by work that paid immediately. The population moved with the certainty that the ground would keep delivering. Mining companies began small, 20, 40-acre leases, but consolidation came fast. Central mills replaced scattered operations. The Eagle Picher mill processed ore from dozens of underground chambers at once. What mattered wasn't ownership of land, but access to flow. During World War I, more than half of the nation's lead and zinc came from this district. Bullets, shells, wiring, materials that vanished overseas and returned only as numbers on balance sheets. Picher became essential without ever becoming visible. The town learned to live at the pace of demand. Shifts ran around the clock. Schools adjusted schedules. Commerce followed paydays. Everything synchronized to the movement of metal beneath the ground. And yet no one spoke about duration. There were no long-term maps on the walls. No conversations about what happened after the ore thinned, or after the pump stopped, or after the tunnels filled with water. Prosperity did not invite those questions. It made them feel unnecessary. When a town's economy is singular, when one resource defines identity, does that clarity create stability, or does it quietly remove choice? Think about it. Would you have asked different questions if you lived here in 1926, with wages steady and the world at war? Or would the certainty of work have been enough? Mining in Picher was not chaotic. It was methodical. Underground, crews followed a room and pillar design, wide chambers carved out of ore, connected by horizontal tunnels, with columns of rock left behind to hold the ceiling in place. Some rooms stretched upward nearly 100 feet. At full depth, the mines reached close to 400 feet below the surface. From above, the town functioned normally. Below, it was becoming a lattice of empty space. The ore that mattered, lead and zinc, was separated at central, mills using flotation processes. What remained was crushed stone, sand, and fine particles stripped of value. Locally, it was called chat. It looked harmless, pale, gravel-like, easy to move. So it was moved everywhere. Chat was piled in towering mounds beside neighborhoods. It was used to pave roads, fill schoolyards, level yards, and reinforce foundations. It became part of daily life, tracked into homes, kicked up by tires, scattered by wind. By the time inventories were taken decades later, there were 83 major chat piles covering more than 700 acres. 31 million cubic yards of waste sat above ground. Fine tailings settled into ponds, exposed to weather, uncontained. Nothing about this felt like negligence at the time. It felt efficient. Waste had no cost. Space felt infinite. What was never calculated was how permanent residue behaves once production stops, because when the machines shut down, the underground voids remained. The tunnels didn't collapse cleanly. They waited. When pumps were turned off, water began to rise, slowly filling chambers that had been dry for decades. This wasn't a failure of engineering. It was the logical outcome of extraction without an end plan. At what point does an industrial system stop being a process and start becoming a condition, something that can't be reversed, only inherited? The earliest warning did not come as an explosion or a collapse. It arrived quietly through water. In 1979, acidic runoff began surfacing from abandoned mine shafts and boreholes. It flowed into Tar Creek, carrying dissolved metals pulled from flooded tunnels below. Iron oxidized as it reached the air, coating rocks and bridge supports in a rust-colored film. Fish disappeared. The creek stopped behaving like a living system. It was visible, it was measurable, and it was treated as an anomaly. At the time, most mining had already ended. The pumps were off. The workforce was gone. What remained was infrastructure without stewardship. When water filled the underground, 100,000 acre-feet, of them, it reacted with exposed minerals, producing acid mine drainage. The chemistry was predictable. The response was not. In 1980, a task force was formed. Reports were written. Responsibility diffused. What did not happen was urgency. Health impacts were discussed in general terms, but systematic testing did not begin. Children played on chat-covered yards. Dust rose in summer. Homes settled slightly, almost imperceptibly. The town continued to function, because stopping would have meant admitting something irreversible had begun. Environmental collapse rarely announces itself as a crisis. It behaves like maintenance deferred, small failures, accumulating in places people don't look. When contamination becomes routine, how do you convince a community that something is wrong before it feels wrong? By the time the warning signs were fully understood, the process was already locked in. When mining stopped, the pumps that had kept the underground dry were shut down. Water rose through hundreds of miles of tunnels and chambers, filling the empty spaces left behind. As it moved, it interacted with exposed minerals, lead, zinc, cadmium, iron, creating a persistent acidic solution. This water did not stay underground. It moved into the Boone Aquifer, the same system that had once supplied wells and sustained the town. What had been a resource became a carrier. Heavy metals spread through groundwater, not in waves but in gradients, slow, uneven, difficult to isolate. Above ground, the soil told the same story. Fine particles from chat piles settled into yards, schools, and unpaved streets. Sampling would later confirm what people had lived with for decades. Lead and cadmium were no longer contained by geography. They were part of the environment. Then the surface began to fail. In 1967, a mine collapse destroyed 9 homes. It was not treated as a turning point. It was seen as a localized event, but the structure beneath the town had been weakened everywhere, not just where it broke through. A U.S. Army Corps of Engineers study completed in 2006 found that 86% of Picher's buildings were undermined and at risk of collapse. Not damaged, not aging, structurally compromised from below. The town had not been eroded by time. It had been emptied from within. Environmental collapse is often imagined as something external. Storms, fires, floods. In Picher, it was internal, invisible, patient. The ground did not suddenly give way. It withdrew its support. The most severe damage in Picher did not announce itself in buildings or water. It appeared in numbers that were easy to overlook and hard to live with. In the 1990s, health studies finally began to measure what decades of exposure had done. Blood tests from Native American children in the area showed lead levels well above what was considered safe. By the mid-1990s, more than 1/3 of children tested exceeded federal levels of concern. Among children aged 1 to 5, the number climbed even higher. Lead does not cause sudden illness. It interferes quietly with attention, memory, development. Its effects are cumulative, often permanent, and difficult to trace back to a single source. In Picher, the source was everywhere. Later studies deepened the picture. Elevated manganese levels in mothers correlated with lower neurodevelopment scores in infants. Miscarriage rates were more than double the national average. Air samples taken years after most residents had left still showed airborne lead, concentrations several times higher than in nearby cities. This was not a single exposure event. It was a background condition. Dust carried by wind, soil tracked indoors, water drawn from familiar taps. Daily life became the delivery system. There was no dramatic moment when people realized what was happening. Understanding came slowly, filtered through clinics, school reports, and patterns that were impossible to ignore but difficult to confront. By the time the human cost was fully documented, the question was no longer how to fix the town. It was whether anyone could remain without absorbing the damage. Once Picher was listed as a Superfund site in 1983, the town entered a new phase, one defined less by repair than by containment. Early efforts focused on limiting spread. Wells were sealed. Dikes were constructed to reduce the flow of acidic mine water into Tar Creek. Contaminated soil was removed from select areas and replaced. These actions addressed symptoms, not structure. The scale underneath the town remained unchanged. Millions of cubic yards of chat on the surface, flooded voids below, aquifers carrying dissolved metals through, a system no longer controlled by pumps or maintenance. By the late 1990s, remediation shifted toward people rather than land. Residential soil was excavated. Entire yards were stripped and rebuilt. Nearly 3,000 properties were treated this way. It improved conditions locally, but it did not stabilize the town. Engineering studies made the limits clear. The underground network was too extensive. Collapse risk was widespread and unpredictable. Full remediation would require removing or isolating volumes of material that exceeded any realistic funding horizon. In 2005, the state began offering voluntary buyouts. The premise was simple and final. Relocation was the only reliable way to reduce harm. Homes were purchased, not repaired. Neighborhoods thinned. Streets emptied unevenly, leaving isolated residents surrounded by vacant structures. After a tornado struck in 2008, the federal decision not to rebuild marked the end of debate. Recovery would not include reconstruction. Protection no longer meant making the town safer. It meant making it empty. At its peak in the mid-1920s, more than 14,000 people lived here. By 1940, fewer than 6,000 remained. Mining slowed, but the town held on. Schools stayed open. Businesses adapted, routines continued. By 1960, the population had dropped below 3,000. The mines were no longer active, but the town still functioned on momentum. People stayed because leaving is harder than staying when the damage feels gradual. In 1990, fewer than 2,000 residents were counted. By 2000, the number had barely changed, not because conditions had stabilized, but because those who remained had nowhere else to go or no reason to start over. The buyouts accelerated what had already begun. Houses were boarded, then demolished. Blocks disappeared without ceremony. Utility lines served fewer customers each year. Services consolidated, then closed. By 2010, the census recorded 20 people. The final years were quiet. One business, a handful of occupied homes, a pharmacy that stayed open longer than anyone expected. When the city was officially disincorporated in 2009, it did not feel like an ending. It felt administrative, paperwork catching up to reality. Population loss is often described as decline. In Picher, it was removal, layer by layer, person by person, until the town no longer met the definition of itself. By the time final decisions were made, the question was no longer emotional or political, it was mathematical. The scale of contamination beneath and around Picher exceeded any realistic threshold for recovery. More than 31 million cubic yards of chat sat exposed on the surface. Fine tailings filled ponds and low ground. Beneath it all were flooded underground voids, an estimated 160 million cubic yards of empty space, saturated with metal-laden water. Removing the waste was not feasible. Isolating it was incomplete at best. Stabilizing the underground structure was technically impossible without dismantling what remained above it. Even aggressive cleanup could only reduce exposure, not eliminate it. The aquifer could not be restored. The collapse risk could not be engineered away. Every solution stopped short of permanence. Cost projections grew faster than funding. Superfund resources were finite. Picher was not the only site competing for attention, and it was one of the most complex. Each year of partial remediation extended risk without resolving it. Safety assessments made the final determination unavoidable. With most structures undermined and collapse unpredictable, continued habitation meant accepting constant danger, not theoretical, but structural. Saving the town would have required rebuilding it somewhere else. At that point, Picher ceased to be a place that could be repaired. It became a condition that had to be exited. When Picher ceased to exist, it did not end with a final departure. It ended when it could no longer perform the basic functions of a town. In July 2009, the post office closed. Mail had been one of the last connective threads. An acknowledgement that people still lived here, that addresses still mattered. When it shut its doors, the town lost its most routine proof of existence. 2 months later, on September 1, 2009, Picher was officially disincorporated. City government ended not because of protest or failure, but because there was nothing left to govern. Services had already stopped. Infrastructure had already been abandoned. The paperwork followed the absence. A few residents remained. Not out of denial, but attachment. One business continued to operate. 6 houses were still occupied. The pharmacy stayed open longer than expected, run by Gary Linderman, who refused to leave until his death in 2015. After that, even the illusion of continuity disappeared. Buildings were demolished for safety. Others burned, some by accident, some by neglect. The mining museum was lost to fire. A church followed years later. What survived longest were the chat piles, immovable, pale, and higher than many of the structures that once surrounded them. By 2019, population estimates reached 0, not evacuated, not displaced overnight, simply gone. A town is not erased when the last person leaves. It is erased when nothing remains that requires another person to stay. Today, Picher exists more as memory than as place. The ground is scarred with giant chat piles, like pale mountains rising from flat farmland. Flooded mine shafts dot the landscape, their dark surfaces reflecting a sky that feels impossibly vast and indifferent. Roads trace empty grids. Foundations crumble into themselves. Ownership is mixed. The Quapaw Nation has taken responsibility for ongoing cleanup on their lands, overseeing long-term remediation in a site that will never be fully restored. Access is restricted. Structural collapse, open shafts, and toxic soils make the area uninhabitable. Nature itself seems cautious. Vegetation is patchy, soil struggling under the weight of contamination, water tinged with rust from decades-old chemical reactions. Walking through what remains, it is impossible not to feel the weight of human ambition and its consequences. Houses that once held families are gone. Schools, stores, and churches have vanished. All that remains are the silent remnants of extraction. Piles of gravel, skeletal industrial structures, and water that never stops moving through tunnels carved nearly a century ago. Picher asks a quiet question. What happens when a town outlives the ground it depends on? When prosperity becomes permanence only in the form of waste and danger, what remains is memory and an unmistakable warning. The story of Picher is not over. Cleanup continues, studies continue, but life here does not. The town exists in photographs, in archives, in the shadows. of the industrial legacy that once promised everything and ultimately delivered loss. This is the ghost of Picher, a place that was born from opportunity, thrived on extraction, and was undone by the very ground that sustained it. Picher is gone, but it speaks, not through voices, not through headlines, not through dramatic collapse, but through the silence that follows human ambition. The land itself tells the story. Pale chat piles rising like monuments, flooded shafts reflecting the sky, roads that lead nowhere. It is a place of memory and warning, a town that supplied bullets for wars, powered industry, and built lives above empty chambers, only to be consumed quietly by the very ground it depended on. Prosperity here was temporary. Stability was an illusion, and in the end, the town could not survive what it had built beneath itself. Picher reminds us that every choice leaves a footprint, visible or invisible. It asks us to consider the cost of convenience, of extraction, of turning resources into lifelines without imagining what happens when they run out or fight back. The echoes of Picher linger in dust, water, and abandoned streets. They linger in the stories of those who once called it home, and they linger in the questions it leaves for us today. How do we live on the land, and what price are we willing to pay when the ground beneath us shifts? If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the quiet consequences of human ambition, subscribe to follow more documentaries that uncover the hidden truths beneath our history. Share your thoughts, reflect on what you've learned, and let these forgotten places remind us of the cost that can't always be measured until it's too late.